Hello, and welcome to this Canadian Global Affairs Institute's webinar on the mood of Americans that we are recording on September the 6th. I'm your host, Colin Robertson. Labor Day is the effective launch of the 2024 elections, including the office of president. The Republicans have already held a first debate in advance of next January's Iowa caucuses and the New Hampshire primary. This campaign is held against a backdrop of anxiety over the economy, especially the cost of living. There is disillusionment about the direction of the country. Internationally, there is concern about China. Then there is the war in Ukraine. We will talk about what it all means for Canada. The U.S. is our biggest trading partner, our principal ally, and we share responsibility for managing our environment and climate. To help situate the issues and attitudes of Americans, I'm delighted to welcome our presenter, Bruce Stokes, and our commentators, Louise Blais, Gary Doer, and David MacNaughton. Welcome, Louise, and welcome back, Bruce, Gary, and David. Bruce is Senior Visiting Fellow at the German Marshall Fund, Associate Fellow at Chatham House, and member of the Council on Foreign Relations. We have all benefited from previous presentations by Bruce. Louise is Senior Advisor to the Business Council of Canada. A career Foreign Service officer, she served as our Consul General in Atlanta and as Ambassador to the United Nations. Gary and David both served as Canada's ambassador to the United States. Gary through much of the Obama administration, and David through the end of the Obama and then the Trump years. Gary also served as Manitoba Premier for a decade. Both Gary and David serve on the CJAI Advisory Council. To begin, Bruce will present his slides for the first 20 or so minutes. Then Louise, David, and Gary will comment on the presentations and what it means for Canada. I'll ask a couple of questions, and then our producer, Joe Callan, will pose your questions. So please use the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen. And I'll repeat that. Please use the Q&A function at the bottom of your screens because we're going to use that later in the show. Bruce, over to you.
Thank you very much, Colin, and thank you much for the invitation to have a chance to interact with both our distinguished panel and everyone who's online. I always like to do these presentations because I know I learn much more from your questions and comments than you can ever learn from me. And it's particularly gratifying the interest that Canadians have in American politics. We Americans joke that you're the 51st state, and I think in these kinds of election years, you kind of serve that function, even though unfortunately and unfairly you don't get to vote, but you have to deal with the consequences, which is something I think most Americans don't appreciate, that we elect the leader of the world and everybody else has to deal with him or her, hopefully someday. So I think that I'll try to share with you today is what we know about in a snapshot of where the voters are at this point, bearing in mind that we're still 14 months away from the election. And that a lot could change. There's certainly a lot of balls in play, but it is shaping up, I think, to everyone's assessment as a rerun of the last election between Trump and Biden. But we can talk about why that is today. So let me first put up the share the results of what we have. First off, in terms of talking about public opinion, I think the thing we have to realize that it is a snapshot. It is a snapshot of emotion, not reason. I always like to joke that if you're looking for reason in a public opinion poll, you're going to have your heart broken. People's level of knowledge is actually very low, and some of these slides will demonstrate that. But that really doesn't matter. I mean, what matters is how people feel, because the reality is people go into the marketplace and buy a red car rather than a blue car because they like red, even though it's, the same car under the hood. And they go to the voting booth and vote because they have an emotional connection to the candidate. Very, very few people can give you an articulated well thought out, rational reason why they vote. Bear in mind when Bush and Gore were competing in 2000 and Bush won, subsequent poll to that election asked people who had voted for Bush why they voted for Bush. And people said, because he seemed like a guy it'd be great to have a beer with. And I must admit, that's having spent some time around Al Gore, they were probably right. But the point being that people voted, a lot of people voted by their emotional sense, not because they liked Al Gore's tax policy or George Bush's environmental policy. So anyway, bear in mind what we're seeing is a snapshot. It's about emotion, and it really does depend about how you ask the question and when you ask the question. First off, the public mood. Voters are pessimistic. As you can see, basically, they think that the good days for America are actually behind us. So there's a degree of pessimism. What we don't know is whether that's driven by rational reasons, the economy is not doing well or whatever, or is it just a reflection of partisanship? Republicans, especially Republican women, think America is in danger of becoming a failing nation. Again, is this a reflection of partisanship, or are Republican women more worried for rational reasons? We don't know the answer to that. Again, one of the problems with polling is that you ask people a question, they give you an answer, you don't really know why they gave you that answer. And short of having some focus groups, it's incumbent upon you as a pollster to report what they tell you and not try to overinterpret what they tell you, because they didn't know necessarily why they just feel that way. The public has more or less agreed on the economy up through the Clinton years. Yes, there were some partisan differences, but very small partisan differences. As you can see, that in the Bush years, and then the Obama years, and then the Trump years, and now in the Biden years, there has been remarkably partisan views of the economy. If my guy's in the White House, the economy's doing well. If my guy's not in the White House, the economy's doing horribly, irrespective of how the economy's doing. And we'll talk about that a little bit later. This is in part, we think, because American voters live in information bubbles. As you can see, Republicans say that they mostly hear negative news about the economy, and Democrats say they don't hear mostly negative news about the economy. This is where they're tuning in to get their news. And we know from other surveys that MAGA Republicans in particular are most likely to be watching Fox News or other right-wing news sources, and liberal Democrats are much more likely to be watching MSNBC or CNN, listening to NPR. And we no longer have, as we did when I was growing up in the United States, three networks that kind of were in the middle and gave you the same story, whoever you listened to, Walter Cronkite or David Brinkley and Chuck Huntley or whoever. So I do think that this is an issue which will continue, because I don't know how you unravel people's partisan sources of information. But there's something else going on here that we can't get we shouldn't just say this is about information sources and about economic angst. Republicans, more than Democrats, by a large degree, fear a moral decline that's getting greater. Now, again, this may be because right-wing news sources are feeding that sense of moral decline, or is it something more profound where especially white evangelical Christians are seeing the world change around them and they don't like it? And remember, we are rapidly approaching a time where we will be in a majority-minority country, and decreasingly Americans say they're affiliated with church and or belong in a faith community. So if you're white, Christian, maybe conservative Christian, you do feel possibly that the world is changing and not changing in a direction that you support. So that's the background. The horse race is that in the recent Republican debate, which was the first kind of kickoff of the campaign, the primary campaigns for the Republicans, viewers thought that Ramaswamy won. And if those of you who actually watched it, he was very forceful and very out front and very dominating. He outshone Ron DeSantis. Nikki Haley, who I personally thought did a very good job, came in third in people's sense of who watched the debate. Notably, there are a number of people on that stage who you kind of wondered why in the world they were there. But the real winner of the debate was Donald Trump. This is a post-debate poll, and basically done by the Wall Street Journal, came out this weekend. A CNN poll that came out this weekend showed the same thing, that support for Donald Trump has actually gone up in the wake of that debate. And it leads Ron DeSantis, who is probably considered to be his most challenging opponent, by such a large margin that if you added up DeSantis's views and those of every other candidate, Trump would still have a majority of the support for the Republican primary voters. What I think is disturbing about the support for Trump, at least from my perspective, is that it has many of the attributes of a cult. This was a question asked recently of the public by CBS, and what they found was that 71% of Trump supporters say they trust Trump, and they trust Trump more than they trust their religious leaders. They trust Trump more than even their friends and family. And I submit to you, this is pretty close to what you'd find in a cult. Moreover, Trump has succeeded in convincing his supporters that attacks on him are attacks on them. This bears deeper discussion and analysis. I think there's a segment of the American public who consider themselves victims of the rapidity of economic and social change. They consider themselves victims, and Donald Trump has identified with their victimhood. Now, how a billionaire womanizer is a victim is, rationally you can't explain, but he has convinced them that he stands between them and more victimization. And you can see this in this result. If you look at specific legal problems that Trump has, and bear in mind, he's now been indicted 4 times on 91 charges. Less than half of the Republicans say in the Mar-a-Lago case, where he is charged with storing classified documents he had no right to hold, more than half of Republicans say he stored those classified documents in a bathroom or on a public stage. We have photographs of this. This brings to mind the old adage, are you going to believe Trump or your lying eyes? Because, again, we have photographs of these things being stored in bathrooms and on public stages, and yet Republicans don't believe that. Republicans, surprisingly, or not surprisingly, I guess, don't see Trump's legal troubles as very serious. Well, Democrats do. And depending, whatever the legal case is, the classified documents case, the federal election in January 6th case, the hush money case with the porn star. But note, to my mind, what's most interesting in this survey result is that less than half of independents see the case as very serious. So while it may not be surprising that Republicans don't take these cases seriously, not enough independents take it seriously to be helpful to Joe Biden. And in the Georgia case, which is the one that is the most sprawling, and bear in mind, Trump would have no control over if he got reelected. 5 and 10 Republicans do not approve of the charges, while 8 and 10 Democrats do. So there's a huge partisan difference in perception of that Georgia case. Looking ahead to the end of the Republican primary, we have the Iowa caucus, and then we have the New Hampshire primary. Those are the two first events out of the gate in early next year. I would say don't pay as much attention to the Iowa caucus results. Historically, the winner of the New Hampshire primary has been the most likely candidate for the Republican Party in November. And so how Trump does in New Hampshire, I think, is going to be more important than how Trump does in Iowa. Shifting to President Biden, his approval is lower than any incumbent president since Jimmy Carter. Again, is this because of his record or because of the growing partisanship of the nation? But whatever the reason is, only about 41% of the public approve of Joe Biden. In part, I think this is due to the growing partisanship of presidential politics. I find this striking. If you look at these results, there's always been a partisan difference that Republicans like their guy more than Democrats like the Republican guy, and Democrats like their guy more. But there's been a dramatic shift from there being, a partisan difference of generally in the 30s every election to now it's in the 70s. So something's happened in American politics that we've all perceived, but this is the data that I think that underscores it, that American presidential elections are more partisan today than they have been, well, really since World War II. Notably, and again, this is, to my mind, inexplicable, Biden lacks public approval on every single issue that's asked. And the one that sticks out for me is that 63% of the American public disapprove of the way Joe Biden is handling the economy. This is an administration that passed an unprecedentedly large stimulus package, an infrastructure package, an IRA plan that looks at climate change and industrial policy, a CHIPS Act, and yet 6 in 10 Americans say they don't approve of what he's done. And there's now a new poll out by CNN over the weekend, but confirms what 2 Washington Post polls have found. People believe he hasn't accomplished anything in the economy. You can disagree with what he's done. You can say it wasn't enough. You can say it's too much. You can say it's a misdirection. But to say he hasn't, a majority of the American public believes he hasn't done anything on the economy is, to my mind, inexplicable, except that the public is worried about things that do exist, like inflation. This is a Fox poll that shows that the post-COVID economic recovery, which, by the way, has been much stronger than the recovery after the Great Recession of 2008, has not impressed the public at all. And despite the lowest unemployment rate since LBJ and the highest inflation rate since Carter, it is the inflation rate, the highest inflation rate since Carter, that dominates public views of what Bidenomics is, that it's led to higher inflation. And finally, there's the question of Biden's age. Bear in mind, he is 4 years older than Donald Trump. And the Republicans have done a very good case of selling Biden as old and bumbling, while Trump appears more vigorous. I think there's no doubt about that. The fact that he is also overweight, out of shape, has a horrible diet, it doesn't seem to have registered with the American public. And so 26% of Americans, when asked, what first word comes to your mind, is that Biden's too old, whereas only 1% of Republicans, public, says that about Donald Trump. Notice, of course, that 15% say the first word that comes to mind around Donald Trump is that he's corrupt. But 6% of people say that about Biden, where, again, I think you have to attribute this to here, as far as we are right now, unsubstantiated charges by Republicans about Biden's corruption. There's just no evidence at this point. There may be some in the future, but there's none now. But again, it's a reflection of the media environment and the polarization that has led to some of these perceptions. But the age of Biden is an issue and will continue to be, I think, throughout the election. So anyway, I've talked too long, but let me do one last thing. Public views on policy issues. 6 in 10 Americans see inflation and healthcare costs and partisanship and drugs and guns as the country's biggest problems. Notice that unemployment is way low at the bottom as a concern. American sentiment about China has never been more negative. It's now even worse than in the wake of Tiananmen. So again, expect actually bipartisan support for being tough on China going forward. But while Democrats see China as a competitor, Republicans judge China to be an enemy. So there is a difference here. Where Americans are worried about it, but they're worried about different things. Republican opposition to aid for Ukraine has quadrupled since the war began, but Democrats' opposition, while smaller, has tripled. So in other words, it's Republicans who really have turned against aid for Ukraine. But there's a small but growing percentage of Democrats who worry about this as well. So this bears watching, especially because there has to be a supplemental for Ukraine approved by the Congress this fall. Notably, among Republicans, Trump backers support Taiwan, but they oppose helping Ukraine and want to withdraw from NATO. So when Trump reiterates his criticism of NATO, there is support among his base for that. When Republican figures on the right question aid for Ukraine, again, there is support among Republican voters. Finally, on climate change, Democrats want action now. Republicans say never or in the distant future, which, again, highlights the fact that even in one of the worst summers for disasters we've had in a long time, very strong weather events, Republicans remain steadfast in putting a very low priority on dealing with climate change. So thank you much. I look forward to comments and discussion.
Bruce, thank you. As always, terrific, but as always, unfortunately, very sobering. Let me turn to our panel now, and I'm going to ask Louise to lead. And my question to you, Louise, and to Gary and David to follow up is, if you were having just seen these results, we've all served in significant positions in the United States and have to interpret what we've just heard and seen back to Canada and why it matters to Canada. So what stood out for you and what would you be reporting back? And just before you start, Louise, I just want to remind the audience to use the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen, because a little later on, I'm going to turn to Joe Callan, our producer, and he'll ask your questions to Bruce or to any of our panel. So Louise, please lead on this. You've seen these results. What stood out for you, and what would you be saying back to Canada, the Prime Minister and Minister of Foreign Affairs?
Well, thank you very much, Colin. First of all, Bruce, thank you. This is really incredible data, and put all together like this for our consumption is really a gift. That was really wonderful. Thank you, Bruce. Well, as David will know, I mean, certainly we were both in office when during the last when Trump won came into view. It's sitting myself. I was sitting in the southeast, so I could really tell a lot of reasonable people were planning on voting for him, and so that's when you kind of go, okay, maybe he's going to get through. But even though we didn't think so, and we all kind of, anyone that was betting in 2016 was betting Hillary Clinton, it was going to be close. But even the Trump side was surprised. But that's a whole other story, I can tell you. They didn't even think they were going to win. They weren't prepared. They hadn't organized anything in terms of a transition, so they didn't even believe in it. But what I'm seeing through this is obviously a very divided America that sees facts in completely different ways, and is unpredictable. And for us, it's going to have an impact. What I really wonder, I take a couple of things out of the presentation above and beyond the obvious. One is China. Although, Bruce, you're right, the view is a little bit different if you're a Democrat or if you're a Republican, but it is the one issue that both sides tend to agree on, that China is a bit of a problem. The degree to which is different, and maybe the approach towards China is something that is being debated, but overall, this is the one issue that they agree with. The other thing that I think about, and Bruce, you alluded to it, is the issue of emotions, which is very much what's going on. I think the last midterm was also emotive on the Democratic side. I think a lot of people came out to vote as a reaction to the Supreme Court rolling back Roe versus Wade. I think that had an impact on the midterms. And so who's going to come out to vote next year? I think that's the big question. Who's going to be mobilized? We all know that the turnout, the percentage of Americans who vote, it's lower than in Canada, even in presidential election. So who's going to be motivated to go vote? Because the moderates and the center, and this is the last thing I guess I'll say in this first intervention, is not only is the country polarized, the parties are polarized within themselves. So you've got the far right and the far left. And for Canada, although we don't play politics in the United States, what's good for us are the moderates. It's the core and the center. And so that's what historically has been good for Canada in terms of policies. The Republican moderates, the Democrat moderates are open to trade and really see Canada as an ally. But what are they going to come out to vote? Is this the group that's sympathetic to our interests in a way? Are they going to be motivated to vote, or is it going to be the fringes on both sides? And if so, in what quantities? And who's going to go to the polls? I think because we all know that makes a huge difference. So I'll end it here for that first statement.
No, thanks, Louise. And I think that's a key question: is who will turn out to vote, which is always critical. And actually, we've seen a rise, I think, in the last election. Bruce can corroborate this later, but traditionally it was about 50%. But I think last time around it was into the 60s. And the Americans, at least, are engaged, even if they can't agree on the facts and are deeply polarized. David, let me turn to you because, of course, like Louise, you were also in the United States when Trump was elected, and it was a surprise, certainly. How would you interpret what you've seen today?
Well, I mean, I think, as Bruce pointed out, we're still a long way away from voting day, and a lot can happen. Even though Donald Trump is a very fit 6'3", 215-pound person, allegedly. There's a lot that can happen in the next year. But I think looking at both what Bruce has presented, but also just my experience in the last while with Americans is there's some underlying trends that are deeply worrying. I think Joe Biden did a really good job of mobilizing or bringing together allies on the war in Ukraine, the invasion of Ukraine, and as we've seen, some of that support has dissipated. But But increasingly, what I see is, America turning inwards, not looking towards the rest of the world, not looking at, at Donald Trump didn't ever like the word ally. It wasn't in his vocabulary. But both protectionism and isolationism is resurgent, and that's not good news for Canada. And well, Louise is quite right. I mean, the people that we dealt with during the tumultuous times of Donald Trump in power and the NAFTA and everything else were moderates and reasonable people and sensible people. And I look around at what some of those people that I dealt with a lot, what they're saying today, and I don't even recognize them. I mean, these are members of Congress, they're senators, they're people in the House who, were rational, intelligent people who have gone on both sides, have gone to what I would describe as the dark side. So we've got challenges in front of us, regardless of who ends up winning the next election, and we can't simply take anything for granted. And the other thing that's kind of distressing to me is one of the reasons we were so successful in dealing with the challenge, the existential threat that was to Canada, was the collaboration between federal and provincial politicians, between the business community and the government, with labor, with Indigenous. I mean, the whole Canada came together and put our differences aside. And what I see happening right now in Canada is increasing divisiveness. And when we've got, I think, a huge opportunity in what the change that the economy is going through, and yet we're increasingly divided as a nation: federal, provincial, business, labor, business, government. And that's not going to work. The United States may be able to get through it because it's the biggest economy in the world. It's got great, educational institutions and everything else. As a country of just barely 40 million people, with the second largest geography in the world, we're not going to be able to do that if we copy the politics of the United States, which we tend to do too much.
David, thanks. Gary, as David says, isolationism, protectionism, these are all issues we've had to deal with, and you certainly had to deal with, even under a Democratic government. And you also saw this as a premier in Manitoba, working your counterpart governors on the other side of the border. What stood out for you, and what would you be saying to your fellow premiers, for example?
Well, just let's start. I think the issue of the age of Biden is a double whammy because of the vice president of the United States as well. So the Republicans will campaign against Biden on his age and argue if Trump gets the nomination. And by the way, only 20% of people, I think, in the United States participate in primaries, but it can have a huge difference about who the candidate is going to be. I think that is a real challenge for the Democratic Party going into this election. Having said that, I noticed in the Wall Street Journal poll just this weekend, Bruce, something that I think is very important as a former premier, which you like to see in polls, is Biden has got a 10-point lead on likability, 48 to 38% over Trump, and honesty's got 45 to 38%. Now, likability comes back to your poll issue of Gore versus Bush. Who do you like to have a beer with? And so I've always found that when you looked at the midterms last year, Biden's likability helped the ticket, particularly in the swing states. And the swing states are actually important to Canada because of the Great Lakes states. There are border states. So I do believe, elections are won or lost in Minnesota, Wisconsin, Michigan, Illinois, Pennsylvania, and I probably missed one, not necessarily Ohio. Bush won Ohio, thanks to Karl Rove's questions on the referendum questions. But these are border states. So one of the things I believe as a former premier, and we've got to activate the premiers in Canada to reach out to their governor friends and fellow constituents in those border states a year ahead of time. I thought the government did a great job. David talked about it with the Team Canada approach. I think we did it after Trump was elected, but having said that, it was effective. I think we've got to start that now. The Business Council of Canada should be working with the Canadian Labour Council to head to those Great Lakes states, along with governors, along with mayors, because a lot of jobs in those states are dependent upon trade with Canada. I would also point out when Obama ran for re-election, the ads were unbelievably against him on China. There were Chinese teachers in American classrooms in the ads that were running again in all those states. So this is not something we haven't seen before. And I know that Trump used China, so to speak, against Hillary Clinton in, again, those Great Lakes states. And one of the reasons he opposed TPP, even though China wasn't in it, was he allowed people to perceive it was part of China. On Ukraine, I do believe the Democrats have got to engage in a more fulsome way. Who do you want, Putin or Zelensky? Ukraine that believes in democracy and practices democracy, or the thuggery of Putin. So I do believe there's a lot of open space that we have to occupy, we and the Americans have to occupy on the choice. It's not pull out of Ukraine, nothing happens. It's pull out of Ukraine and the Russian president gets a huge win. And I don't hear this enough. I think we're a little too passive on the argument for why NATO, Biden, and the Americans and NATO is in Ukraine. And I think there's a lot of room there to improve our game and get more feisty and more forceful and more effective.
Bruce, let me come to you. Gary talks about NATO. I'd asked a visiting NATO political director what frightened him the most. Was it Russia victory in Ukraine, a Chinese invasion of Taiwan, or the return of Donald Trump? And he didn't miss a beat. It's the return of Donald Trump. Your slides point out that many of his supporters had pulled the U.S. out of NATO and stopped back in Ukraine. Last time, the discipline of power, I think the adults in the room, Congress and the courts, tempered a lot of Trump's instincts. Is the system of checks and balances up to a return of Trump? Bruce?
I think we have to worry about that. I think that one of the lessons Donald Trump appears to have learned from his first term, and we saw this at the very end of the first term, is he is not likely to surround himself with seasoned people who may tell him, boss, you can't do this. He seems to want to surround himself with yes men and women, people who will not try to curb his actions, but actually try to reinforce them. And if that's the lesson he learned from his first term, then I personally believe we're in real trouble, because there'll be no constraints imposed upon him by his chief of staff or by the various cabinet secretaries or whatever. And it would appear that members of Congress in his own party are unwilling to go up against him. They aren't. Very few of them are doing it now. And if he wins election, my guess is it'll be even fewer, because they'll say, this is a tide and I have to be with it, or I'll be swept out of office. So I do think we need to be worried about Trump in a second term feeling unconstrained. And NATO is one of the issues we need to worry about. But there could be a whole range of other issues that, he has already talked about, and again, he talks about a lot of things, and you can't assume he's going to do all of these, about trying to reduce the number of career people in the bureaucracy and replace them with more political appointees. And that would take us back to a federal government with the kind of personnel policies of the 19th century. The less professionalization and of the people who actually make the government run and work. And I also think you would see a huge exodus of career people across the bureaucracy. We experienced that in the State Department during the first Trump administration. And the State Department is still trying to rebuild, still trying. They lost a whole generation of mid-career people who you just don't replace overnight. And so there's all sorts of issues like that, I think, that we'd have to fear in a second term.
Thanks, Bruce. We talked about Trump and how some of the lessons we learned from last time. There's still a year and about 5 months left in the Biden administration. We've got the roadmap, and during President Biden's visit to Ottawa in March, they expanded collaboration around climate mitigation, innovation around electric vehicles. This includes how to access critical minerals and make supply chains work better. We want to make our shared border more efficient and resilient. We're also engaged in NATO modernization. So I'm going to start with you on this one, David. How are we doing on these files, and what do we need to do, or do we have to prioritize? And then how do we get it done? Because we still do have a year and a half left in this administration. So David, why don't you lead on this one, please?
I'm skeptical of an awful lot being done in the next year. I recall, when I presented my credentials to Obama in March of 2016, and there was all this talk about bromance, and that everything was going to be sweetness and light, and I went to the U.S. trade representative and said, let's sit down and solve the softwood lumber dispute. And it turns out that that what Obama wanted to do as a legacy was to have the United States be part of TPP. And there were senators like Ron Wyden who he needed his support to get TPP done, and Ron Wyden didn't want to have anything to do with softwood lumber. So basically, I couldn't make any progress on the softwood lumber file. And I think if you look at what's going to happen increasingly starting, right now, is that the focus is going to be on what is going to be good for electoral politics for Joe Biden, not what is going to happen about that roadmap. A collaboration on industrial policy, good luck. If the labor unions in the United States don't agree with it, it isn't going to happen, I think. And then you've got NORAD, and frankly, unless Canada decides to step up in terms of its military spending and commitment, that's just words. That's window dressing. And as we've seen on climate, I don't know what specific initiatives that there'll be collaboration on. Critical minerals, we started that conversation back when I was in DC, and I was talking to somebody, a senior person in the U.S. administration a while ago, and said, why don't you do what you did that started our aluminum industry in Canada? Why don't you do some sort of a take or pay contract with, to get some of these critical minerals out of our country? And his response was, well, David, we'd love to have some critical minerals from Canada, but we'd like them before 2050. And when we look at your processes for approving new mines, it's going to take you 20 years, 25 years to get any approval. So why would we bother wasting our time when we can get them from elsewhere? So that was a really interesting discussion between Biden and the Prime Minister, but I'm from Missouri, as they say, in terms of whether it's going to happen.
Gary, you're from Manitoba. We've got 15 months left. What would you prioritize, given David's skepticism and given this is the last year and a bit of this administration, at least for now? Well,
I would take the money we're going to get for selling TransCanada Pipeline to different folks now that it's going to be completed in 2024. I'd definitely step up NORAD and do it in our own backyard. Do it in the Arctic. Our neighbor is Alaska and Russia, and I would do that. I would not wait. And I think there's a lot greater was always this issue of military spending in the budget and, the argument of what's the priority internally in Canada. I think Canadians now, with Putin going into Ukraine and so many folks in Canada just flabbergasted what's going on, I think they would support increase in military spending directed at protecting the Arctic as part of our contribution to NORAD. And secondly, on critical minerals, you mentioned Manitoba. We've approved a state-owned enterprise taking over a mine in critical minerals in Canada. I can't believe it. I'm saying that as somebody that doesn't criticize my successors, because I believe once you're finished being elected, you just move on and move on. And David's point about approving things, this is a can't-do approach. We've got to be decisive. We've got to decide what we want to do and pass the laws that get them done quickly. And, the First Nations, and I know in northern Manitoba, we passed mineral right royalties to the First Nations in their land. So they'll get an economic benefit of the royalties, and they'll secondly get an economic benefit of the jobs. And David's point is valid. I second his motion. And I second his motion in two ways. One, doing it, and two, being perceived to be doing it with our American friends, and then making those critical minerals available too in the North American continent, in our neighborhood, rather than just taking our chances with a state-owned Chinese enterprise.
Louise, you and Goldie have written a very good piece in Policy Magazine that we'll link to in the program notes, and what we can do in the next 15 months. Do you want to sort of share with the audience some of your thoughts and what we should also be watchful of?
Sure. Well, first of all, in terms of the Biden administration and the 1 year that's left, let's just at least realize that it's not been that, the Biden presidency has not been that great for Canada. I mean, the values, the social values, and yes, we feel more at home as Canadians with Biden perhaps, but, this has been a presidency that has been extremely ambitious in terms of its legislative agenda and passed a great deal of bills as well as executive orders that double down on Buy America and pro-America manufacturing provisions. So they have now thrown us, we did get the EV tax credit, but only to find ourselves in an incentive race to attract green manufacturing. So I'm not saying I would throw in the towel, but I would concentrate the next year or so for the next administration, whichever it might be. And I think the number one priority for Canada is coming right up in 2026, which is the renewal of the USMCA. And we need that deal renewed. We need it renewed. We don't want it reopened. It's a Pandora's box. So we want that smooth. And the way in which you try to assure that, and this is back to Bruce's point and all the points that have been made, all of this is relationship building over a long period of time. And even though it's complicated right now to engage with the Trump entourage for reasons that are very clear, at the same time, we still need to have communications bridges with people somewhat close to them. And probably the safest bet to do that, or it was people in Congress, senators and congressmen and women that we know are in his camp and are speaking to him, because it was Sonny Perdue that helped save NAFTA and then sent us in the renegotiation. And thanks to Jean Charest years before, had built CP with him when he was governor, and then 10 years later, lo and behold, he's the knight with a shining armor. So I think the next year is making sure we speak with everyone. Gary mentioned it, the border states, the governors, the elected officials, and take our message to them, primarily about USMCA renewal and about all the other things that are that really, let's face it, that we do for Canada. And then the last that I just want to reiterate, and that's in the piece as well, what David and Gary said, a lot of the work that we can do in the next year is really at home. It's really in Canada. Yeah. It's just making sure we don't end up being a problem. And part of this is not just the investment in defense and military that was highlighted. It's also making sure that we're compliant with USMCA. Because if we want to renew it, if we want to be the champion of saying this deal works, well, we have to be compliant with it ourselves. And so in that sense, this is why the digital tax issue is poorly timed. It exposes us. We still have the dairy. I know it's a tough one, but we have to figure it out, because if we want to be effective advocates for USMCA, we have to at least be living by it ourselves.
Thanks, Louise. Joe, let me turn to you. A couple of questions from the audience that we can turn to the panel, and Bruce?
Yeah, for sure, Colin. Thank you. And yeah, so just in the interest of time, we only have about 10 minutes left, so we'll just quickly go through some questions that I've consolidated. But to begin with, we have a question from Jean Charest, which is, what will be the role of foreign policy in the presidential election, and in particular, the difference in narratives between the Republicans and the Democrats?
Okay, I think I'm going to put that one to Bruce. Foreign
It's
policy.
great. It's a great question. Foreign policy has traditionally not played a major role in American elections. I doubt that, absent a crisis, that it will be a major role. It'll be a secondary or tertiary role. But in that position of secondary or tertiary, it's going to be China. It's going to be Ukraine. If China were to do something untoward about Taiwan over the next year, that would obviously elevate that issue dramatically. If the Ukrainians appear to be failing in their attempts to win this war by next year, I think one thing I can say about my fellow compatriots is that we like to be on a winning team, and if Ukraine is perceived as not being the winner but is losing, I think this antipathy towards continued support towards Ukraine will grow, and so it makes it a bigger issue. It may depend on what kind of issues Trump, and let's assume he's the nominee, brings up. I mean, Democrats will be forced to support NATO if Trump really goes on a anti-NATO rant and makes it a bigger issue. But I think the issues that will really dominate the election are going to be the economy. Does it slow down? Does inflation come back a bit or not go away? And a narrative that somehow the Biden economy is not comparable to the Trump economy, even though the underlying facts are that, in fact, the Biden economy is better than the Trump economy.
Thanks, Bruce. Joe, second question.
Yeah, another question that really struck a few of the attendees is the chart that was shown on the partisan differences in terms of economic facts. So the question is, to what extent can partisan disagreements on these facts, for example, the health of the economy, be attributed to the rise of social media and the associated misinformation?
Okay, good question. Bruce, I'll come back to you on that one.
Undoubtedly. We know that people on the right get their economics information from right-wing sources that have repeatedly emphasized the inflation issue, have not significantly reported the employment issues, which are great. I mean, we have an unemployment rate of like 3.6, 3.7%, which is fantastic. The unemployment rate among African Americans is its lowest ever. I mean, there's a lot of success here, but it's been underreported on the right. And on the left, I think there is a failure to understand that inflation, even though it's coming down, is an issue that people confront every day. They drive down the highway, and even if they don't fill their car with gasoline, they see these signs along the road about what the price of gas is, and it reminds them every day that it's higher than it was a couple of years ago. They go to the store and they have to pay more. So even though we can say, practically speaking, inflation is going down, and oh, by the way, it's an issue that the president has almost no control over, but it is still an issue that I think troubles average people more than any other single issue.
Okay, Joe, another one.
This is actually a question from John Manley, who's the chairman of our advisory council. Is there any advice from the panelists for a neighbor to a superpower, which in the future could be controlled by a, quote, cult?
Okay, why don't you lead on that one, Gary?
Well, it's hard to. I've never confronted a cult before, and I'm glad John Manley asked the question because
Cult members need an intervention, so maybe we need an intervention.
totally, yeah. Well, the only advice I've got is get them all to drink the same Kool-Aid, I guess. But that's a horrible solution. They've got to. I mean, it has to be challenged within the Republican Party, and it has to be challenged in the primary. And before the election, I think there'll be greater success at the election versus the primary. I have to say that I have been impressed with a couple of the candidates who are going to be good for Canada and are not leading a cult. Nikki Haley, I thought, did a great job in the debate. She visited Canada. We had all the Jean Charest and I attended as premiers a meeting she held as a governor in South Carolina. For those people who are Clemson football fans, we started the Canada-U.S. Institute at Clemson University with her. So my vote is for the anti-cult candidate, Nikki Haley, with a good sense of what the world needs in terms of the United States' strength and foreign policy. But that's my only answer, John Manley, unless you've got a better one, because you're closer to the center of the universe in Ottawa than I am out here in the boonies.
All right, I'm gonna let Louise come in on that because she lived in a state which is going to be critical in the next election in Georgia. Louise, dealing with the cult.
Well, I can tell you, actually, the cult is strong and it exists, but it's not the entire Republican Party. And really, there is what's behind all these numbers is the fact that really the majority of Republicans probably would prefer somebody else than Trump lead the next. There's still a lot of Republicans who believe that he's got too much baggage, he's holding them back, and they actually think he's not rational. And I know that I speak to a lot of my friends down there that hold positions today, and so it's encouraging that there is this sense, but there is, with each indictment that comes, it also the reverse effect, unfortunately. And this last one in Georgia, for example, even reasonable Republicans are seeing Fani Willis as self-interested, and she's the prosecutor of a county, and they feel that it's really not the place of a county prosecutor who's Democrat, who also helped fund Democrat candidates to lead the charge against somebody that they don't respect anymore. So you see, it's kind of strange. On one hand, they really would like him to go away, but on the other hand, what's happening now is raising concerns for them, and so we end up with a bit of a cultish that goes on. But it's complicated, and I'll just end by saying this is the first time in over 120 years since a defeated president is running for office again. Last time they lost, and I think it was Grover Washington who was elected. Grover Cleveland, who was elected. But what was interesting, when he came back, he won the popular vote, but he lost the Electoral College. And finally, when he came back 4 years later, he won. But
we'll see if history repeats itself. Because the time is short, let me turn to you, David. And I'm also going to ask you had to deal with the cult, as John Manley puts it, but I also want to know what you're reading or streaming these days. And I'm going to ask the rest of the audience, and that'll be our final response. So David, please start.
In the summer of 2016, there was a cabinet retreat, and I was asked to address American politics and what was likely to happen. And I said to the cabinet to do not count Donald Trump out. I'm not saying he's going to win, but I do not assume that Hillary Clinton is by definition going to win. And my advice was, and please shut up about Donald Trump, because he will hold whatever you say against you forever. And my advice to Canadians about the cult and about Donald Trump in the next year is the same. Don't be smug, don't be critical, just go about our business, do what Gary and Louise have talked about in terms of building bridges and relationships and don't be smug and hypercritical about American politics. Let's worry about our own. And what am I reading? I'm actually reading a series of essays that has been published by the University of Toronto Press and edited by Emmett McFarlane. And it's called Dilemmas of Free Expression. And it is extraordinarily topical at the present moment because it talks about, what does it mean, freedom of speech, and in various segments of our lives, and what should be the constraints on free speech, both by governments and by the courts and all this kind of stuff. It is a fascinating read with a whole group of different perspectives on it. So that's basically what I'm reading.
Excellent. Thank you. Bruce, what are you reading or streaming these days?
Sorry, Colin. I believe Bruce had to
Okay.
leave for a hard break.
Let me move then to
at noon.
Gary.
God, I'm reading an escapism book. I'm reading just finishing Daniel Silva's book, The Collector, which does talk about Ukraine and Russia, but it's not on the level of David's book he cited. So Louise may have elevate my literary choices.
All right, Louise, elevate the choices.
Yeah, I think written by a woman, so there's that. But I'm reading really again because I read it recently, The Globalization Myth: Why Regions Matter by Shannon O'Neill, and it's really the big case of globalization really didn't happen, but we really were organized by regions, and North America has a huge advantage if we only take it.
Excellent. Well, thank you all. I hope you've enjoyed and learned from this CJI webinar. We were joined today by Bruce Stokes, Louise Blais, Gary Doer, and David MacNaughton. You'll find Bruce's presentation on the CJA website, and we'll be broadcasting this session as a future Global Exchange podcast. This webinar was brought to you by our team at CJAI, and my thanks go out to our producer, Joe Callan, who also asked the questions. I'm Colin Robertson. Thanks for joining us today.